So, welcome everybody to this session. Does someone recognize the music that was in the intro? Yeah, it's Mission Impossible. And I will hopefully prove to you that this is not Mission Impossible to actually protect your data in Azure. Hands up if you were to the Gdpr session yesterday with Per Tornelius. Yeah, quite many of you. I know that he hinted that I will answer some of your questions, so I hope that I will fulfill your expectations. Speaking of Per, he is a colleague of mine, and we both work at Active Solution. I see a few other Active Solution people in this room. At Active Solution, we help customers working with .NET, but also a lot with Microsoft Azure and the cloud platform at Microsoft. We specialize in building component-based applications to use what's pre-built in Azure to go to market even faster and build even more secure products. And me, myself, Peter Örneholm, I worked at Active Solution for a couple of years. I love doing front-end development, but I also love doing architecture and development using the Azure platform. And today I will share my knowledge on doing secure development in Azure. But speaking of me, let me bring you back to this summer. Me and my family, I have a daughter. She's 1.5 years old now. Not that tall, but she is growing for every day. She loves to swim, so we went out to the Stockholm archipelago. The sun was shining on us, and it was a really beautiful day. And we enjoyed our weekend there. And then on the Monday morning, I was on the subway, as usual, towards Rådmansgatan, where I work. And usually, if you live in Stockholm, you know that someday you need to kind of squeeze yourself in on the subway because they're so crowded in like 8 o'clock in the morning. And so you actually, usually you have to stand like this, but if there's a lot of people on the subway, you don't need to hold anything because there's only many people, so you can just stand there and you won't fall anyhow. But this specific day, I was actually able to grab a seat. It's not every day that you can do that. So I was able to grab a seat, and to kind of celebrate that, I actually had the time to bring up my phone. So I started by looking at my Twitter feed. That's kind of my morning procedure to see, are there any new cool Azure blog posts that I should read up about? Any new cool technology that I should know about? But I also enjoyed some time watching YouTube videos. So there were this trending video of a cat, as usual. So that enlightened my mood a bit. But then this phone started vibrating, and I had received an email. And the subject line stated, "We have been hacked, and your data might have been breached." And I was thinking, I was scared. Like, was it the pictures that I uploaded from the weekend with my family? Or was it maybe the finances that I put in the cloud? Or whatever it was, I didn't like that it was breached. I didn't like that the information, my private information, was out, maybe in the hand of a hacker. And it doesn't matter what information it is. This doesn't matter if it's really private. I want to be in charge of whether I put it online on Facebook or wherever. I don't want the company that builds these services to build insecure services that can be breached. So, maybe you've heard of Gdpr. Hands up if you went to this session because it had the Gdpr in the title. Some of you did. Who of you did go to this session because of Azure? So it's more because of Azure. And I like that because GDPR is up and coming. And I think GDPR is a really, really good thing. There are a lot of scary GDPR tactics. People say that, and you might have heavy fines. There might be a lot of money that you need to pay if you don't follow GDPR. But me personally, I put a lot of my personal life into the cloud. I put a lot of my personal information into the services that I use. And I really care about security and privacy. So I think whether or not GDPR is here, whether or not GDPR, I really like that you take your time to go to this session and that you care about Azure and that you care about especially security and maybe GDPR. And my expertise, as I introduced you with, is that I really like Azure. I'm an expert in Azure technology. And I will today show you how to use really, really awesome features in Azure to be maybe not GDPR compliant out of the box, but it will at least help you on the road towards GDPR compliance. But I think why you should do this is because you should really care about building secure services that will keep your users' private data secure. And I think, previously, you might think that, for example, you think that we don't care about privacy because that will take so much time, and we want to focus on building a really cool feature with awesome animations and awesome features. And maybe you over here think that we focus everything on security and privacy, but we don't have that many features because it's hard and it takes so much time to building that stuff. But I will show you how to easily use features in Azure to build with both security as well as awesome features. Because there are so many features out of the box in Azure that will help you on this road. But let's start with GDPR. So, if you went to the session yesterday, you got the basics regarding the law stuff. And speaking of law, when you grow up, there's this classical thing that your parents might either want you to be a lawyer, they might want you to be a doctor, or a civil engineer. That's kind of the three basic paths. I know times are changing, but let me just make it clear that I didn't choose the law path. I know enough law, and I know enough about GDPR that I can tell you what's important and how Azure relates to it. But in conjunction to this session, you should also invest time in looking and maybe speak to a lawyer to get the details right. But I will focus on the technical stuff because I chose the technical path when I grew up. To go back to GDPR, when I received that email on my phone on the subway, I received an email, and maybe that service that was breached, they actually followed the breach notification law. So by law in GDPR, you need to notify your users within 72 hours of that you've been hacked. Not 72 hours after you realized you were hacked, but actually after you were hacked. Maybe you send an email to them telling it, or maybe an SMS, or you call them, depending on your business. Next up, your users have the right to access their data. If they have put private or information into your service, they actually have the right to access that again. So for example, if I upload a lot of images to a service, I actually have the right to access that and see what they store about me. I also have the right to port that data. Data portability is important. And that means that I can require a service to export my data in a structurable, readable way. That might be JSON, it might be XML, or it might be a zip file, depending on what kind of data you are storing and what kind of service you are delivering. And also, the right to be forgotten. If I realize, for example, when I was sitting on that subway, the service I was using had been breached. Maybe I don't trust them anymore. And then, after I have exported my data, I'm able to require them to delete me completely. And this might impact your business. This might impact you. If you are building a service that is not secure enough, if you don't get the trust from your users, they might be able to export all the data they have provided and just move to a new service, because I assure you, a more secure service will probably find a way to import that JSON file that you export. And then they will probably require you to delete them. So user after user after user might leave your service if it's not secure enough. But there is a fifth thing in GDPR. This will solve this. Privacy by design. Because you have to, by law now, or soon in May, this will take action in May, you have to design your systems to be private, or to take privacy into account from day one. So hopefully you will never end up in this situation. But in every step you take towards making your service or building your service, as like, it should be as natural as choosing a NuGet package or making a test or doing whatever, privacy should be a #1 thing that you need to think about. So enough about GDPR and the specific stuff there. Let's go back. Let's take Azure and let's exemplify this and see how we can do this in action. So I've identified 3 steps that I see is important to make a really good, private, secure service in Azure. But first, you need to start aggregate data. To be able to notify, to be able to realize that you've been hacked, you need to start aggregate usage data, to aggregate audit logs, to see how is my system being used, who is accessing my system, and what's being accessed. And then, because a modern system, if you have many users, there will probably millions or billions of log rows. No human can look through that manually. You need to find ways of automatically identify strange patterns, automatically identify if someone is trying to breach your system. And then you need to be alerted. Whether it's an email to you, whether it's a notification in a Slack channel, that's up to you. But you need to realize something is happening. But wouldn't it be best if we could avoid it altogether from the beginning? So I will give you some really awesome tools to avoid being hacked or being breached initially. But most important of all, and I know because you're here, you have already taken this action, is to act, to do something. And because you're here, because you actually prioritize going to this session, you're started acting. There are many ways towards GDPR compliancy, but going to this is at least a first step. So to do something, to have like to have a roadmap how to achieve this secure platform. So let's take an example. And throughout this session, I will make a lot of demos, so it will be really hands-on in the Azure portal. But I will show you an application that's built on this architecture that I will show you now. So to begin with, we have me there. I will exemplify the user of your system. I'm accessing a website. Maybe it's a website. It could also be an app or whatever. In this case, the architecture is using a few services like Azure CDN, Traffic Manager, Web Application Firewall, and App Services. That app service, in turn, uses a lot of different services under the hood, maybe storing data in Cosmos DB, using cache in Redis Cache, messaging between different services using Service Bus, for example, and log in so that I'm authenticated using Azure AD. What I want to show you is that a normal application today is dependent on a lot of different microservices. And side by side, you probably have some logging stuff. You might have some secret handling in Azure Key Vault, and eventually you do backups to Azure Backup, for example. And on top of this, we will look at a few services that can start getting insight in all of the data that we are aggregating. And we won't have time to go through all of them, so I focused on a few. We'll try to look at web apps, SQL. We have Azure Storage, for example. Look a bit on Azure Key Vault to store our secrets, Monitor to get an overview, and Azure Security Center to get an overview of all the security in our applications. But let's dig into the aggregate one, step number 1. So here is our application. And these are a lot of different services that the user can access, or the user accesses the website, which in turn uses, for example, a SQL database. And to be able to get insight into how these are being used and whether or not they're being hacked or not, we need to start aggregate. So we need to start to find ways to let them actually dump all their logs or dump all their usage data into other services. So we will see how we can start aggregating the data there into, for example, storage or other logging services. So let's dig into a demo. You see my screen? So throughout this session, I will demo stuff in the Azure portal. On a daily basis, we use mostly Azure ARM templates or Azure PowerShell or other ways of automating this. But for you to have a visual thing of what I'm actually doing, I will be using the Azure portal. And I myself use the Azure portal for exploration because it's a great way of finding out new stuff. For example, new security features that I have enabled. But to be really secure throughout your application, you should probably automate a lot of the stuff we will be doing today. But you are smart enough to find the documentation for PowerShell or for ARM templates yourself if you just get the grasp of the concepts that you do. So let's start with aggregating. We will look at a SQL database. So this application had a SQL database as we saw. And I will open up that server. So for a SQL server, it would be really good if we could aggregate and look at and start collecting all the data of who is using this specific. Whether or not it's a developer accessing the SQL server and the SQL database from SQL Server Management Studio, or it may be an app out in the field, or it may be a web application running somewhere else. So, on a SQL server, you can enable auditing and threat detection. It's over here in the portal. By doing that, I'll enable auditing. For auditing in SQL Server, we store all of our data in a storage account. So I'm clicking through a bit. I've prepared a storage account where I can store it. I will store it forever in this case. And there's also another cool feature, which is, so once we have enabled auditing, which is quite easy, but that's only aggregating all of the stuff, we will also turn on threat detection. That will start looking at our data. And I will get back to that and the really, really awesome feature, how this can help you with AI and machine learning to actually understand all of your audit logs. But let's enable them. So now, because I did this on the server level, whenever I create a database in that server, that will inherit the settings. So now all of my, send email to, let's make it. Whenever I create a new database on that server, all of the databases will inherit these settings. So let's move on. In addition to the SQL database, it's really good to enable some logs on our web application, for example. Let's bring up that one. So let's take this one and we go to application settings. We go to diagnostic logs. So here I've already prepared. So for this website, all of the logs are dumped into the same storage account so that it can be analyzed. And by default, you can say that store them forever. But if you don't have a use case for that, I would say store them as short as possible, because due to Gdpr, you don't want to store data too long, because the user can require you to delete their existence, and then it's hard if you have too long of a backlog of your data. So this is an easy way of enabling data for web apps as well. Of course, there are different ways for a lot of other services. You can enabling data collection for your application using application insights. You can start collecting raw telemetry from your virtual machines using log analytics. And there are, for kind of every service and every thing in Azure, you can aggregate data. We don't have time to go through them all, but just the concept to start looking at how can I collect data from my different services. So to recap, make sure to collect audit data, who is accessing what. Collect usage data, because that can be relevant. For example, an application log from Application Insight. If you see that, for example, someone is accessing /admin much more frequently than you have users, there is probably something going on. And also down at the application level, for example, if there are buttons or there is like changes in the pattern how the application is being used, that can be a signal that something is wrong. And use services like Application Insights and Log Analytics. But as I promised, this is kind of the boring stuff because you just need to collect data. But to get insights into it, we need to be alerted. So if you go back to this architecture diagram, at first we collect data, so we have information on what's happening, but then we want to have insights into it. And we will look at services that can use machine learning and AI to actually understand what's happening and alert us before we even know that something bad is going on. So, let me get back to that demo. So, as the subject was, there is actually a feature in Azure called alerts. So there is a way of getting an overview of all alerts we have in our system, but let's get back to our SQL database. SQL databases is collecting some information that we can start adding alerts on. So if we go down to alert rules, I have beforehand created something that will alert me if there are too many failed connections to my database. But let's create a new one together. So we'll call this blocked firewall. So we give our alert a name. And then there are some metrics. So we can actually see here that during this morning, was it 9 o'clock? There were quite like 20 connections to the database that was blocked by the firewall. And because I didn't have any alert, I wasn't aware of it. It turned out that because I got a new IP address when I entered this building this morning, that IP address wasn't activated in the firewall in SQL Azure. So that's why it went down then, because I allowed my IP address. But if you want to be alerted on this in the future, we can actually say that if there are more than 5 blocked access to this, we can see kind of a baseline when this would have been triggered or not. So if there are more than 5 blocked connections over the past 5 minutes, please send me an email. Or you could use a webhook that could be connected to Slack or the whatever application of your choice. But by doing this, there is quite messy because maybe you don't know the baseline. When should I actually be alerted? Or is there anything else that might be interesting to look at? So instead, because I enabled, do you remember I enabled the threat detection? That's basically machine learning finding out when to... So this is, it says that it's not explicitly enabled, but it's inheriting this from the server. And because threat detection is enabled, they will run machine learning and statistic algorithms over our data and our audit logs, and they will find out when there are suspicious patterns, for example. So, let me go back to PowerPoint and show you how this can look. So in a live project which I'm working in, we actually got this email a couple of weeks ago. So threat detection had figured out that someone has logged onto your SQL server from an unusual location. And it turned out that usually all of our employees at Active Solution work in Stockholm, but then this specific day there was someone logging on from Malmö. So we found out that your usage pattern is Stockholm. Like 99 or 100% of the time up until now you have logged on from Stockholm. Why are you logging on from Malmö? Is it a hacker in Malmö? What's happening? In this specific case, I think it was that someone had logged on from they had used their mobile phone as the internet provider, and that turned up as an IP address in Malmö. So it wasn't actually a hacker in this case. But these kind of log things, it would be impossible for you to look through your logs to find out this manually. And another thing, I was speaking of Application Insights. Application Insights is collecting logs from your applications that also has this smart feature called Smart Detection, which is basically also machine learning under the hood. They will do the same thing. They will look at what's your what's your baseline? Do you have any issues? They will more look at, are we having more issues now than yesterday? Is there a change in the pattern for how exceptions are thrown? And as you can see here, in this case, they said that there's an abnormal rise in exception volume, and in this case, it was a security error. it turned out that it was an error from JavaScript and that we had an issue that we tried to access some storage location that we weren't allowed to or something like that. But it's a really, really good way of getting insights into when our logs are changing. So to recap, you need to start analyze, but it's impossible for you to look through and to create alerts for every scenario. So you need to use AI and machine learning, not by yourself, but by products that Microsoft have built for you. So tools like threat detection and application insight smart detection can really help you out. And make sure to be alerted. Make sure that you have some way of getting an email, or there are actually partners with Microsoft, so you can have schedules. Maybe you are not the one to take that email this day because you're on vacation. So there are ways of having the right person gets the right email at the right time. But let's dive into the subject I like the most. How do we avoid these from the very beginning? Instead of just being alerted that our system are being hacked over and over again, let's get back to the drawing board and actually make a secure service. And let's take the case with data. As I've already mentioned a few times, SQL is a quite common thing in an application nowadays. I know that, for example, Cosmos DB is up and rising, and it's a really, really awesome feature, an awesome service. But I think we see that a lot of customers still are using SQL. So, to begin with, according to Gdpr, you actually need to start identifying what information you are storing. Because not all information are classified as personal or private data. Some information is just, it doesn't matter if it might matter, but it's not as problematic if it would be hacked or disappear. So you need to start identify where in SQL am I storing potential security data or privacy data. So you probably want to start encrypting this. And there are at least two ways of encrypting data. Both you have data at rest. So whenever you write something to SQL and that eventually write it down to disk, you want to make sure that that data is encrypted. Data at rest, when it's resting, as they say. But you also have data in transit. Data that is flowing through some Ethernet cable or a fiber cable somewhere. Maybe down to the users, to the laptop of your users. So we want to encrypt data in transit. But we also want to restrict. As of this morning, when I entered this building and got a new IP address, I was actually restricted to access the SQL database in Azure because of firewall rules. So we want to make sure that we restrict usage to only those who need to see the data. And even if as a developer, I might have to see and I might have to access the SQL database, but maybe I don't need to access all of the data. Maybe I don't need to access the specific data, but maybe an impersonated version. We'll look at that. And to the user, as I mentioned, a chain is not like stronger than the weakest part. So if your data is encrypted, everything like within the data center, but then your users walks in at, for example, yesterday when I prepared the last things for this session, I did it the hipster way, went to Starbucks at Stockholm Central Station, and like rehearsed a few stuff, and used to make a point, actually accessed their open public Wi-Fi, which is not encrypted. So that might be your users. If they are sitting at a cafe using your service over an unencrypted network, if you're not enforcing HTTPS on them, if you're not enforcing encryption at data in transit all the way, it doesn't matter what security you have in your data center. Because eventually that data might be lost and you will be blamed for it. So, we'll look at how to enforce HTTPS. And maybe, did you read the blog post from the Google Chrome team last night? So they have eventually started telling that in case you have recently, if you had a password field or had any kind of input field on your website, they would say not secure in the title. But if you were running on HTTP and not HTTPS. But they have now said that from July and on, all web pages running HTTP will be marked as not secure. And if your service are not running on HTTPS, I guess some of your users might call you and say, hello, your service is not secure. So enforcing HTTPS will be kind of a requirement because of the security that Google Chrome is doing. But let's get down into the demo. we will start, as I said, we need to start figuring out what kind of data do we have that is classified according to GDPR. And it turned out, just about 10 days ago, Microsoft introduced something called Data Discovery and Classification for SQL databases. And to begin with, you need to start classifying. I already classified, but there is actually one column here that I didn't classify. So they will start looking at your SQL database, and based on patterns and based on statistics, they will say that in the schema sales RLT, in the table address, we have found this column called address line 2, and we think that that might be contact information, and we know that contact information is confidential according to GDPR. So they will give you a good baseline. I guess you know your domain, but in a lot of legacy systems there might be thousands of tables, thousands of databases, and it's impossible to have everything in your head. This will be a really good start for you to start identifying what information do we have. So we say that, yeah, this was a good thing. We accept this as a recommendation. So we add that to the list. So now we have actually started classifying all of our columns, whether or not it's contact information, and whether or not it's confidential. That will give us a really good overview of what kind of information we are storing. So we can see that, for example, we have 9 columns that are confidential according to GDPR. We have some columns that are just confidential. Maybe not according to GDPR, but they are private information. For example, a password, for example. So this gives you a really good overview. And what they will do then, when you have started classifying, Microsoft will use machine learning to see that are there any suspicious patterns for these specific columns, because hackers would probably target these columns when they want to retrieve data. So they will use statistics and machine learning to try to find out, is there any suspicious activity on these specific columns. But it also helps you to find out what information, and we will look at how can we impersonate this data as well. Another awesome feature is a vulnerability assessment. So basically you can, I've already done a scan because it takes a couple of minutes, but you can take your database and they will run, in this case it's 40 rules being applied. So they're looking at, are there anything that could be done better in your database? Are you missing any security features that we have available? And it turned out I hadn't enabled them all. So for example, threat detection, when I ran this scan I hadn't enabled threat detection, but we did just a couple of minutes ago. We just classified one of the sensitive columns. Not all of them were. Transparent data encryption isn't enabled. So let's do that. So it turned out that it has identified that we haven't encrypted the data. So let's go to that one. So as we said, encrypting data at rest is a really, really good thing. And according to GDPR, a lot of the stuff we're doing now, it's not that in the GDPR law it says that you should have transparent data encryption in Azure to be GDPR compliant, of course. But all of as I understand from the session yesterday and my colleague Per, you need to be able to tell what actions have we taken to be a more secure platform, a more secure product. And encrypting your stuff is one of those things that can really help you out. So let's encrypt it. And the really cool thing here is that it doesn't require you to do any change to your application, because the encryption is handled in the management layer. When you access the database, that is handling the encryption and decryption for you. So this is, now it started encrypting the database. So if someone, I don't know how anyone would do that, but if someone would get hold of a hard drive that actually contains your database, they wouldn't get anything out of that, because now it's encrypted. So, and that's a really good thing. So let's move on to Security Center, as I mentioned, because now we looked at a SQL database, but there are much more to an application than just SQL. So, in Security Center, it will give you an overview of all the services and applications you're using. And here we actually get an overview of the different storage accounts, different SQL stuff. So it will actually flag some of it. So in this case, it doesn't update instantaneously, but we can see here that we hadn't enabled audit and threat detection on our SQL database. neither had we enabled TDE. After a few minutes, it will realize we had done so. But this is a really good start to see, from a technical point of view, are there any security features available that we haven't enabled? And it gives you some links, so it's really easy for you to enable them as well if you've missed out on it. So Security Center is a good feature and a good service for you to get an overview of security features available that you can use. Let's move on. I already showed you how to enable encryption for data at rest in SQL. Nowadays, there is also available for storage. If you're building an application in Azure, you should not store files on disk if you're using PaaS services. Instead, you should probably be using Azure Storage. And this is kind of hard to demo that you should enable it, because if we go down to, for example, Blob service, it turns out that from a couple of months ago, you can't really create a new storage account without enabling encryption. Or you can, but it's not that easy. So pretty much all of your modern storage account will be encrypted. So whenever you store a file or whenever you store a blob, that will be encrypted at rest. But if you have a legacy system, it might be good to go to this specific tab and make sure that all of your data is being encrypted. And other services like Azure Search, Azure Messaging, and all of those, they are also encrypting your data when it's at rest. And you need to read the specific details for each service to find out whether or not they are doing it. But I think that the goal from Microsoft is that every service at May 20 or May 18th or 25th or whenever it is will be encrypted. Let's move on to data in transit, because we also want to make sure that we encrypt our data when it leaves our service and it reaches the end user. So let's bring up our web application. So by default, and this is our web app. Let's go to this. No, it's already HTTPS. So I actually haven't deployed that much to this website, but let's try Chrome. While that is loading, right now it will accept us to both access it over HTTP and HTTPS. But we want to enforce that all of our users are actually redirected to HTTPS. So from now on, if you search for domain, there we go. As you can see, I'm accessing this over HTTP. And as I said, from July on, there will be not secure here. It will say not secure, and your users might be worried. Of course, you can do this in code. You can have like web configuration, or in ASP.NET there are middlewares to enforce HTTPS. But nowadays there is this button in the portal. If you press on there, they will have this management layer in between that will enforce HTTPS. So if you don't want to make changes to legacy applications, for example, or maybe you're not in control of that, you can really easily ensure with either a PowerShell script, just walk through and enable it all, or just make sure to do it on your service. Let's look at storage as well, because it's the same thing. For example, storage, it's a really scalable service that can be accessed straight from a client. And nowadays, you can enforce HTTPS here as well. It's called secure transfer required instead, but that actually means that whenever you access the storage service, it needs to be done over HTTPS, and they will disable the HTTP endpoint. So this is also a really good thing from a security point of view, so that you don't by mistake access data over HTTP. So let's enable that as well. And it's the same thing for example, Azure CDN and a lot of different services. Almost all of them now have ways of enforcing HTTPS or enforcing a secure connection, whether or not you're using Redis. Like Redis also has that, for example. So just to make sure that all of the services you're using disable the insecure ways of accessing it. And also, as I said, and this is a really cool feature, you should be able to restrict who has access to what. And let's go back to the SQL database that we looked at. Let's bring up, did you know there's a query editor nowadays? So you can actually run queries against your database in the portal. That's quite cool. And I have a secure password, so I will paste that one. So here we can actually start browsing. Now I'm logged in as an administrator. Let's bring up the tables with the sales, because we knew that had some sensitive information. I think it was, or let's do like this. I actually have a query prepared. So let's take that one. And run this. So this will give us some customer information. And there are probably scenarios. For example, the real application needs to access the real last name and the real company name and the email address of the user. But me as a developer, or me as someone who needs diagnostic and something in production, maybe I don't need to have the specific email addresses, because what if my account gets breached? What if I am the weakest point in the chain? So there is something called dynamic data masking. So you can actually say that a lot of people will have access to this database, but we will dynamically mask sensitive information when it leaves the data center. So, in the SQL Server Management Studio, I'm logged in as a developer, as myself. And as you can see down here, let's connect again. As you can see down here, I'm doing exactly the same query, but instead of getting the real email addresses, we have added masking, so it's still a valid email address, but it's not the real email address. The same thing, the first name is a valid first name, whether or not someone will be called XXX is another thing. But I don't get hold of the personal information. And this is really easy, and by default, Azure suggests to you some of the stuff that we have realized that you have, for example, the address with address line 1, or we have the last name. I think you should actually mask that, because there is no reason everyone should get hold of that. So let's add a mask for last name. So if you just go back to SQL Server Management Studio, as you can see here, I still get the real last names. And that might be a security issue or a privacy issue. So we mask last name. We have some options here. We can have some custom masking, but by default we can just say that use the default string. Let's save it. If we go to the query editor again, as an administrator, you will get the whole view, but as a developer in this case, it now started to be masked. So this is a really good way, and this is a really good thing according to GDPR. You can say that only those who actually need to access production data does it. But as a developer, you might need to access it for diagnostics, but then you can actually limit what you may do with the data. So that's a really cool feature. And also, as I mentioned a few times, you can restrict it to IP addresses. So let's bring up our server, and there's a firewall where we can configure settings. So a lot of services in Azure now are able to be restricted to either a client IP. So for example, if you have your internet deployed to Azure as an Azure App Service, let's actually bring up that as a case. So maybe this would be your internet. Maybe you only want to be able to access it from your office. Networking. Sorry, IP. Did you? Yeah, thank you. So there is now this IP restrictions. So you can actually say that this website is only available from these IP addresses. And that enables you to restrict, for example, maybe your development environment shouldn't be publicly available so that no one actually tweets out your development address. Then you can restrict that to specific IP addresses. And this can be applied to either storage, web apps, SQL. A lot of these services supports it. And let's wrap up. And when we are speaking about web apps, another thing that could enhance the security of your application is actually looking through what frameworks and stuff you have enabled. Because by default, Microsoft will enable PHP and a lot of stuff in your web application. But if you're only deploying .NET, maybe you can, or maybe you should, and I think you should, disable PHP, for example. Because what if you have an upload feature, someone uploads a PHP file and are able to execute that? Then it's much better to disable all of the frameworks, disable all the stuff that you know you should not be using. And make sure that, for example, Python and Java is also disabled if you're not using it. Of course, if your application is a Java or a Python application, that should be enabled, and disable .NET instead. And yeah, so last but not least, a really, really cool feature, which is also quite new. It's called the policy feature. So basically, policies, we have done a lot of stuff. We have done, for example, enabled threat detection. We have enabled auditing. We have enabled encryption. And we have enabled IP restrictions. But all this stuff, if you don't have any way of following up on it or make sure that everything is according to your policy, it's hard. But nowadays, you can actually create policies to say that this feature or this box has to be checked for us to be compliant. So you can create a lot of those rules, and then you can group them into something they call initiative. So now, before this session, I created something called Gdpr, which is, of course, even if we would fulfill all of the rules, we wouldn't be GDPR compliant by default. But, for example, I can make sure that all of my services should follow these rules. They should be monitored in Security Center. They should have auditing. We should not allow some third-party services that we don't trust, for example. We should require blob encryption. And we might also enforce that we should that we should only allow some specific locations. You can set up a policy that by default all of your services should be deployed to either West Europe or North Europe, because you know that then the data will be stored within EU. So this is a really, really good feature to be able, and let's say that you are compliant eventually, but then you can set up an alert. So whenever someone creates something that is not compliant, you can either block that creation to ensure that you are always following the rules that you have set up, or you can just send an email to yourself so you can start having a discussion with this. Yes, I think that was some of the really cool features that you can use in Azure to walk towards compliancy. Let's just recap. Let's skip this. So this is, we can just mention it. If you have, like, for example, connection strings or other configuration in your application, have a look at Azure Key Vault, which is a really secure way of handling secrets and configuration in your application. But we want to avoid getting breached or getting hacked. Look at identify, where do I have sensitive data? Where should I start my investigation? Make sure to encrypt data at rest. Encrypt data in transit. Use HTTPS, for example. Restrict access. First, maybe you only restrict it to IP, but then make sure to restrict access so that only those who need to see the full dataset can see the full dataset. Look at configuration. Disable stuff that you're not using. Disable PHP, for example, if that's not your language of choice. And you can also look at authentication. There are ways of really easily enable authentication for Azure Web Apps, for example. So we've looked at this application. There are much more services in Azure, and 50 minutes is only a limited set of time. We've looked at some specific ones of them and mentioned a few of them. There are, for example, the policy thing, the Security Center. We have application insights that have smart detection for your logs. We have CDN, which can enforce HTTPS, for example. We have web apps, which can do HTTPS as well and enforcement of it. We have SQL, which has a lot of really cool features where you can detect where you have sensitive data so that you don't miss out on a column. It would be really, really embarrassing if you have this one specific column that caused you to not be compliant. And we have storage, which also supports encryption and stuff like that. And this is all in Azure. And I think there, of course, there are other ways of deploying stuff, but I think the really, really cool thing with using a platform such as Azure is that you get a lot of stuff out of the box. Microsoft puts millions and millions of dollars into making it a secure platform so that you can focus on building the best service available that is both secure and hopefully GDPR compliant. So even if you're not that interested in GDPR, I think at least me, as a person, as someone who puts private stuff into your services, I'm really glad that you take your time and start working on creating next services that will be more secure than ever. So, before we end up, are there any questions on this subject? If not, time's up. I'll be at the Active Solution booth. Feel free to come by and ask me anything regarding Azure or GDPR or security. I'll be glad to have a conversation with you. Thank you for taking your time, and see you.